Welcome to Aquatics by Nature. Well, it's finally happened. I finally started on one of my new tanks, and I figured probably the best place to start was actually with the background. And I know a lot of you have commented on my previous videos, actually on the background on this 29-year-old no water change, no fertilizer tank. And what I really wanted to do was something quite similar, something that would be, again, sort of nice and equally easy, something relatively inexpensive, and certainly from my point of view, something that's really long lasting, because if you haven't guessed by now, I like my tanks to last. And I wanted something, again, like this background that would just sort of weather in naturally and really serve as a foil for the plants that are actually in the tank to sort of really kind of show them off. And it's not necessarily to kind of try and replicate any kind of scene or anything on the backing. It's just something relatively neutral that can sort of algae up like this one and maybe grow a few things up it, like mosses, liverworts, maybe some bucephalandra, something along that line. And whilst I know that's quite a lot of criteria and it's probably a bit of a tall order, it's definitely a good thing to sort of aim for, as it were. Now, initially when I was going to do these tanks, I was actually going to use the same backing as this one, but being as 29 years has sort of passed since I did this tank, the design has actually changed a bit over the years, and it's also quite an expensive way of doing it, and I didn't quite like the new one quite as much as the old one, so I kind of been racking my brains a bit for a while trying to think of a kind of an alternative that I kind of felt I'd be happy with and that I could kind of live with for the sort of foreseeable future, as it were. And I've been searching for some time, trying to find something off the shelf, as it were, just to make my life easy, as it were. And I really couldn't find anything that I really liked. So that's really led me down the route of trying to think of some sort of maybe DIY options, as it were, something that I could do myself so that I could actually have it maybe how I wanted it rather than just what's available, as it were. Anyway, fortunately, a few weeks ago, I was actually having a bit of a clear out in my garage, and I actually stumbled across this. It's actually a material called alpha grog. It's a sort of porous ceramic material. It's really kind of lightweight and it's also inert. And for those of you not familiar with it, it's actually commonly sold as filter material, especially for pond filters. And this, in actual fact, is actually left over from my shop days. I must have obviously bought way too much when we used to have a pond section and forgotten about it and sort of stashed it in my garage. Anyway, this material, it has a really big surface area, hence why it's used for filters, because it's got a huge area for the microorganisms and biological filtration and everything to actually work on, as it were, or attach to, should I say. And their website actually sort of describes it as having an extremely high surface area, being highly porous, inert, pH neutral, lightweight, available worldwide and economical. So that kind of got me thinking, really. I thought, well, what if I could use this stuff to actually make a backing? And I kind of figured that if I actually was to be able to make a wall of this right the way across the back of the tank, it actually looked quite interesting. And again, I think it would be really good for just sort of showing things off against it. And one of the things I really like about it is, as you can see, every little piece of this is actually unique. And every little bit is a different shape, different size, different colour. And I think that just makes it a little bit more interesting and maybe a little bit less sort of contrived, as it were. And in actual fact, being extremely porous like this is actually a really useful trait. And I don't know if any of you have ever tried, but for anyone who's actually ever tried gluing rocks to glass, it's extremely difficult because silicone doesn't really stick to anything other than glass, and it tends to fall off of especially flat surfaces. So one of the really great things about this sort of porosity and all the holes and things you can see in this material is you can actually use this to its advantage. And I know from previous experience, if when you're actually doing it, what you do is if you glue or push the glue into as many of the gaps as possible, you kind of end up with a situation where all those little bits that have gone in all the holes and nooks and crannies, they end up as almost like little reinforcing rods, as it were, so that when you stick it to the side of your tank, it's not just the outer surface that is stuck, it's stuck almost from the inside, so it makes it much, much stronger and much, much more successful. Anyway, by luck, I actually had a spare tube of black aquarium silicone. So I kind of thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, let's try it on one of the tanks. So I thought I'd give it a go on one of the 180 litre empty tanks that I've got. I've got 3, so I thought, well, let's try one and see how it goes, as it were. So all I simply did was simply laid one of the tanks on its back on a towel, just so that it was protected, as I knew it would be kind of almost impossible to actually stick these to a vertical surface, simply because gravity's not on your side and they're likely to slide down. Although the glue is quite tacky and the material is quite light, but I didn't want to risk them sliding down. So anyway, I set about the task, and in order to kind of make it really as random as I possibly could, because I didn't, as I say, want it to look contrived in any way. So literally, I just got this bucket of alpha grog here, and literally I would pick up each piece, literally blind, as it were, sort of pick them up without looking, so just like lucky dip, so that I couldn't actually deliberately choose one any particular colour. A bit silly, I know, but it kind of works just to do things in a random way. And I don't know if it's my imagination, but the black aquarium silicone seems to be somewhat thicker than the clear stuff, so it's actually a little bit easier to work with. It doesn't kind of go all over the place in the same way that the clear stuff seems to, or maybe that's me, but there you go. Anyway, all I do literally is, once I've selected a piece, is literally find the flattest side of each individual piece, and then just like this, just put out a really generous blob all over that side, making sure that, as I say, you put it into as many of the holes and recesses and literally all over one side in every possible bit you can. Kind of overdo it a bit, to be honest. The idea really is just to get as big a contact area with the glass as you possibly can. That way it should stay really firm sort of indefinitely. It's not going to fall off sort of unexpectedly or anything. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, this is quite a slow process, because realistically, to do it like this, every single piece has to be done individually. So it's just one of those things that you just have to sort of persevere with piece by piece until it gradually builds. And I try kind of as much as possible to kind of tessellate them so as not to leave too many gaps. And it's kind of a little bit like a giant jigsaw, really, because once you've got the glue on each piece, you then have to kind of find a gap that it just sort of slots into, as it were. Because realistically, the idea is to try and keep the gaps between the pieces as small as possible to get as near total coverage as is kind of realistic, doing it in this kind of way. Anyway, as I'm sure you can guess, I ran out of silicone really quite quickly. The one disadvantage of being generous with it, you get through it quite quickly. Anyway, while I was kind of waiting for more silicone to arrive, it gave me the opportunity to actually make absolutely sure that the first lot had actually stuck and bonded absolutely solid. That the last thing I wanted to do was to spend hours doing the whole tank and then find that it wasn't working. Anyway, I was quite fortunate in that, in actual fact, they'd stuck way better than even I'd imagined. I was really pleased. They were rock solid. There's no way they're coming off in a hurry, even with quite a good sort of tug. They were not coming off. Anyway, it's really still quite difficult to see how it might actually end up looking, because when the tank's laid on its back, you can't really see what's going on. So it's just one of those things you have to kind of persevere with. So once the next lot of silicone had arrived, I kind of just stuck with it and just kept on going. And as I say, it's one of those things. It's not for anyone who's kind of a bit impatient, because it does take a little while and a bit of patience to actually do. But gradually, sort of piece by piece, it just sort of gradually came together until eventually the whole area that I wanted to cover was completely covered. Now, I should point out at this point that I actually decided deliberately not to cover the filter box on the right. Having the black box there doesn't particularly bother me, and I thought having rocks or pieces stuck all the way around a square box, I thought would actually look more artificial than just simply having a black box, which tends to blend into the background anyway, so I wasn't overly worried about that. Anyway, once the tank was actually completely done and the silicone had kind of overnight to dry, I basically just tipped the tank back up the right way so that I could kind of admire my work, as it were, especially as I spent so long on it. And as you can see, there was one kind of minor flaw, but before you say it, I knew that this was always going to be the case, that there was always going to be lots of gaps. It doesn't matter how carefully you try and tessellate these things, there were always going to be gaps. So anyway, I'd always got a plan, as I say, for this. And one of the reasons actually for using black silicone was that it would just sort of merge into the background and wouldn't show up. If you use clear silicone to do this, whilst you won't particularly see it, if you do ever use any medications or anything in the tank, the silicone tends to take the colour. So you could quite end up with a situation where all the silicone blobs are bright blue, for example, and that could look pretty awful in the future. So I would always definitely recommend using black silicone if you're going to do this. But anyway, before I show you the last bit, I'll actually just show you a quick snapshot of the back of the tank from behind. Basically because this shows really nicely just how much silicone I used. And yeah, okay, it's kind of rather generous blobs to say the least, but as I say, it's not coming off in a hurry, so I was quite happy and quite pleased to kind of overdo the silicone a little bit. Anyway, there was a really quick, easy fix to filling all the gaps, as it were, and that's simply to paint the outside of the back of the tank with black paint, really simple as that. And that basically just makes everything merge into the background and you never know there are any gaps between things. Now, if any of you ever tried painting actually straight onto glass, you'll probably know that the glass needs to be absolutely spotless if you try and do this. Otherwise what you'll get is lots and lots of streaks and strange areas where the paint simply will not stick. If this does happen, if you try it, it's not the end of the world. You can normally get over it simply by putting a couple of coats on, and it just disappears, and let's say it merges, so it's not that critical. But fortunately, this tank being brand new, the glass is really quite clean, so I didn't have any problem. It went straight on with just one fairly generous coat of black paint. It didn't cause me any issues at all. So anyway, I guess what you'd really like to see is actually how it turned out. Well, I hope you like it, and I know it's probably not to everyone's taste, but I think I'm quite happy with it. Ta-da! Anyway, as you can see, it now looks incredibly different. With all the black paint and properly illuminated by the aquarium lights, I think it shows it off really quite well. And certainly for a first attempt, I'm really quite pleased. I think I've achieved, yeah, really what I wanted. And as I say, once it kind of greens up and it weathers in, I think it will be a really nice foil for whatever I choose to actually plant in front of it. And I think probably my top plan for this is actually to use a moss called Physidans, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with, but it's a very nice feathery moss that just sort of creeps over the surface. And what I like about this, and what I'm hoping anyway, is that if I can get this to carpet most or some of the actual rock that I've just put in there, I should get an effect of kind of a bit like a knobbly carpet, really. Kind of, if you've ever seen kind of like moss carpets in woodland, or actually a Japanese moss garden is probably the best example. It's like lots of little balls of moss kind of interlocked together. And yeah, I think that could look rather cool. Well, I can dream anyway. I mean, it's maybe a bit optimistic, being as I haven't even got any water in the tank yet, but as I say, we've got to dream a bit, as it were. And I think what I'm probably going to do, I'm going to do at least one more of these 180 litre tanks like this. This one actually took me, I think, around about 6 hours all told, but that's not including drying time, obviously, which I don't think that's too bad a period to spend doing a backing, as it, being especially as it didn't actually cost me very much to do. And as I say, hopefully it'll last a nice long while, as it were. Anyway, this should enable me to finally crack on and actually get something in the tank and actually get to the fun bit of planting and what have you. And the next video, what I plan to do is to actually start covering something on how and what I use for substrates. This will basically, or it's what allows me to be able to run my tanks super low maintenance without any water changes or fertilizers, etc. I've got quite a lot I'd like to say or like to cover on this sort of subject, so what I might end up doing is splitting it into more than one video, but I'll see how it goes. It's very difficult to tell when I start as to how long my rambles actually end up, as I'm sure my regulars are more than used to, and I'm sure the same with this one. So anyway, thanks very much for your patience once again. Hope to see you all again soon. And If you want to know more about how I maintain these tanks so naturally, without water changes or fertilizers, I'd be eternally grateful if you subscribe and give me a like. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching.